Weddings are supposed to begin with joy, but this one began with a sound no groom should ever hear. Not music, not laughter, not the soft chatter of guests getting ready, just one fragile sound. A frightened tap, echoing from a part of the house no one ever goes to. Most people would ignore it. Most people would assume it was the pipes, or the wind, or a staff member moving boxes. But one thing about life, it whispers before it screams. And when he followed that tiny whisper, when he walked down that silent corridor filled with wedding decorations waiting for morning, he opened a door and found the person he protects most in this world, alone, shaking, and locked inside a storage room. And a few feet away stood the woman he was hours away from marrying. If you've ever discovered a truth that broke your heart in 1 second, you'll understand why this story begins exactly here. Before we begin, tell me one thing. Have you ever had to choose between love and family? Just answer yes or no in the comments, because by the end of this story, you'll know exactly what choice Elias had to make. The house stood silent under the weight of anticipation. Dawn had not yet broken fully, casting the estate in that uncertain blue light that exists between night and morning. The kind of light that makes shadows seem deeper, that turns familiar spaces into something unrecognizable. He had driven through the night, unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong. The voice note his sister had sent kept replaying in his mind, not the words themselves, but the tremor beneath them, the way her breath had caught before she spoke. The steering wheel had felt cold under his hands despite the warmth of the car's interior. And now, standing in the marble foyer of his own home, that same cold seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Wedding preparations surrounded him. White roses in crystal vases lined every surface. Ribbons of gold and ivory draped from the ceiling. The scent of lilies hung heavy in the air, almost suffocating. But something was fundamentally wrong with this picture. The house should have been alive with movement, caterers rushing through, decorators making final adjustments, family members emerging sleepy-eyed from guest rooms. Instead, there was only silence. He moved through the ground floor, his footsteps echoing against the polished floors. His sister's bedroom door stood open, her bed made untouched. The small easel where she painted in the mornings sat empty by the window. Her slippers, the soft brown ones with embroidered flowers, rested neatly by the hallway that led toward the service wing of the house. Then he heard it, a sound so faint he almost convinced himself he'd imagined it, a soft, rhythmic tapping, weak, desperate, coming from somewhere deep within the house. His heart began to race as he followed the sound, each step quickening. The tapping grew slightly louder as he approached a narrow hallway lined with storage rooms. One door, the farthest from the main house, had a chair wedged beneath its handle. The recognition of what he was seeing hit him like physical violence. His hands moved before his mind fully processed the implications, yanking the chair away, forcing the door open with such urgency that the wood splintered slightly against the frame. She fell into his arms immediately, her body trembling so violently he could feel it in his own chest. Her skin was cold, her eyes were unfocused, pupils dilated in a way that spoke of hours spent in darkness. Her fingers were raw from where she'd been tapping against the door, and there were streaks of dust across her cheeks where tears had run. He held her as she collapsed against him, feeling the rapid flutter of her heartbeat, the shallowness of her breathing. And in that moment, he looked up. His bride stood at the end of the hallway, frozen. Her wedding robe hung loosely around her shoulders, cream silk that caught the early morning light. But it was her face that told the complete story. Eyes already swimming with tears, hand pressed against her mouth, body rigid with the realization that what she'd done had been discovered. She had locked his sister in a storage room on their wedding day and left her there, Have you ever trusted someone who broke your heart in a way you never expected? 3 weeks earlier, the house had been different. Full of life, full of hope, full of the kind of anticipation that makes ordinary moments feel touched by magic. Elias Kwame had built his empire through patience and precision. Import-export, real estate, technology investments, each venture carefully considered, each risk calculated. But his wealth had never defined him the way his steadiness did. People spoke of him with respect that went beyond his bank accounts. When he entered a room, conversations didn't stop out of intimidation, but out of genuine interest in what he might contribute. He was the kind of man who listened more than he spoke, who noticed details others overlooked, who made decisions that rippled outward with quiet certainty. His home reflected this nature. A sprawling estate on the outskirts of Lagos, modern but warm, filled with art his sister had helped him choose. Large windows let natural light flood every room. The garden stretched out in careful abundance. Native plants, flowering trees, a small pond where dragonflies hovered in the afternoons. It was a place designed for peace, for family, for the kind of life he'd always imagined building. And now, it was being transformed into something even more meaningful, his wedding. Staff moved through the house with purpose. Florists arranging centerpieces, caterers planning menus, event coordinators checking every detail against elaborate lists. The guest wing was being prepared for relatives traveling from across the country and beyond. Every room smelled of fresh paint and flowers, of possibility and new beginnings. His younger sister had thrown herself into the preparations with quiet enthusiasm. Tarella was 22, with gentle eyes and hands always stained with paint or charcoal. She preferred corners to center stages, preferred creating to performing. But she had emerged from her studio to help with the wedding, to be part of this moment in her brother's life. She moved through the house like a shadow given form, arranging flowers with an artist's eye for composition, suggesting subtle changes to the color schemes that somehow made everything more cohesive. Sitting with the musicians to discuss the emotional arc of the ceremony's soundtrack. She didn't speak often, but when she did, people listened. There was something about her observations that cut through noise and reached truth. Elias would watch her sometimes, feeling his chest tighten with protective love. She had been through so much. Years ago, before he'd made his fortune, before he could shield her from the world's harshness, she had experienced something that had changed her fundamentally. He didn't know all the details. She'd never spoken about it directly, but he'd seen the aftermath. The way she flinched at sudden sounds. The way crowded rooms made her breathing shallow. The way she needed to know where exits were, needed to feel safe before she could relax. He had become her safe place. Her constant in a world that had proven unpredictable and cruel. And she had become his anchor. The reminder of why wealth meant nothing if it couldn't protect the people who mattered. Their bond was visible in small moments. The way she would seek him out when social gatherings became overwhelming, standing quietly beside him until she could breathe again. The way he would check on her studio every evening, a soft knock, a gentle inquiry about her day. The way they could sit in comfortable silence for hours, him working on his laptop while she sketched, both simply content to share space. The wedding had been his idea, but he'd asked for her blessing before proposing. They'd sat in the garden, evening light turning everything golden, and he'd explained that he'd found someone he wanted to build a life with. Someone elegant and strong and ready to stand beside him as he continued growing his legacy. Tarella had smiled, her rare full smile, and told him she was happy for him, that she could see the love in his eyes when he spoke about his intended, that she looked forward to having a sister. And now, as the wedding approached, she seemed genuinely excited. She'd painted a portrait as a gift, a stunning piece that captured something essential about the couple's connection. She'd been practicing the small speech she'd prepared for the reception. She'd been trying so hard to be present, to push through her natural anxiety, to show up for the brother who had always shown up for her. Selena Cordier represented everything Lagos high society admired. She carried herself with the kind of poise that suggested generations of refinement, though her actual background was more complicated than appearances suggested. She had fought for her position in elite circles, had clawed her way up through sheer determination and strategic brilliance. She'd made herself indispensable to the right people, had cultivated the right relationships, had transformed herself into someone who belonged in rooms where power and wealth congregated. Meeting Elias had felt like destiny. He was everything she'd been searching for, successful but not ostentatious, respected but not arrogant, wealthy but not consumed by materialism. He saw her as an equal, a partner, someone to build with rather than someone to display. She'd fallen in love with his quietness, the way he thought before speaking, the way he treated everyone with the same measured respect, regardless of their station. But as the wedding approached, something had begun unraveling inside her. The pressure was immense. This wasn't just a wedding, it was a social event that would be photographed, analyzed, discussed. Guest lists read like a directory of Nigeria's most influential families. Every detail mattered. Every moment would be scrutinized. One misstep could become gossip that followed her forever. Her mother had made this abundantly clear during their daily phone calls. The woman's voice carried decades of social anxiety wrapped in the language of high expectations. She would list everything that could go wrong. The wrong music choice, poor flower arrangements, unseasonable weather, difficult guests, any number of catastrophes that could transform triumph into tragedy. But increasingly, her mother's concerns centered on one particular element, Torella. The girl was too quiet, too withdrawn, too unpredictable. What if she had some kind of episode during the ceremony? What if she drew negative attention? What if people started questioning Elias's judgment for allowing his sister such prominent placement in the proceedings? Selena had tried to dismiss these concerns initially. Torella was sweet, talented, harmless. But as the wedding drew closer, as the pressure mounted, as her mother's voice grew more insistent, she began to see the girl through different eyes. The way Torella would suddenly leave rooms when they became too crowded. The way her hands shook sometimes when addressing the wedding party. The way she needed repeated reassurance about small details. These weren't charming quirks. They were warning signs, liabilities, potential disasters waiting to unfold. And underneath all of this, buried so deep Selena barely acknowledged it to herself, was a memory that haunted her with devastating clarity. Years ago, before she'd reinvented herself, before she'd become the polished woman now preparing to marry a billionaire, she'd had a younger sister, a girl with bright eyes and an infectious laugh, someone everyone adored. But the girl had been sensitive, prone to overwhelming emotions, quick to tears in moments of stress. During an important family event, a political fundraiser her mother had spent months organizing, her sister had frozen. Simply stopped functioning in the middle of the crowded ballroom, tears streaming down her face, unable to speak or move. The gossip had been vicious. People had called her unstable, had suggested mental illness, had made the incident a source of entertainment. 2 years later, her sister had died in a car accident. Selena had never fully processed the connection between the social cruelty and her sister's subsequent spiral into depression. She'd simply buried it, along with the guilt of not protecting her better, not standing up to their mother's harsh judgment, not being the older sister she should have been. Now, watching Torella, all those unresolved emotions surged back with choking intensity. The similarities were too strong. The same gentle nature, the same quiet vulnerability, the same potential for public embarrassment. And Selena's mother kept calling, kept pressing, kept reminding her that this wedding had to be perfect. that there could be no mistakes, that everything she'd worked for depended on flawless execution. The rehearsal dinner arrived with all the weight of a coronation. The estate's grand ballroom had been transformed into something from a magazine spread, cascading fabric creating an intimate atmosphere, despite the room size, lighting designed to flatter every angle, tables set with precision that bordered on obsessive. Guests arrived in waves of expensive perfume and designer clothing. Politicians rubbed shoulders with business moguls. Old money mingled with new money, with the careful dance of mutual assessment. Cameras flashed constantly. Professional photographers Selena's mother had insisted upon, plus countless phones capturing every moment for social media. The energy was electric, but also suffocating. Every conversation felt performative. Every laugh seemed calculated. Even genuine moments of warmth carried an undercurrent of judgment, as though everyone was both participant and critic in the same social theater. Elias moved through it all with his characteristic grace, greeting guests, accepting congratulations, making people feel valued with his quiet attention. He was in his element, not because he loved the spotlight, but because he understood how to navigate these waters without losing himself. Selena felt like she was drowning. Her dress, a flowing ivory gown that had taken weeks to perfect, suddenly felt too tight. The room temperature seemed to climb with each arriving guest. Her mother kept appearing at her elbow with urgent whispers about who needed special attention, which conversation she needed to join, how she needed to project confidence and warmth simultaneously. And through it all, she kept seeing Tarella. The girl had dressed carefully for the evening. A simple but elegant navy dress that suited her quiet nature. She'd even agreed to wear her hair in a style one of the bridesmaids suggested. She was trying so hard to be present, to participate, to honor her brother's important night. But the effort was visible in her tension. The way her shoulders climbed toward her ears when the room got too loud. The way she kept smoothing her dress with nervous hands. The way she stayed near the edges of the room, participating but not immersing, present but protected. Selena watched her attempt to help arrange some last-minute decorations, saw one of the wedding coordinators snap at her impatiently when she moved too slowly, saw Tarella flinch at the harsh tone. The girl recovered quickly, apologized quietly, continued helping. But something about her careful movements, her gentle persistence despite obvious discomfort, made Selena's throat tighten with irrational frustration. She's trying too hard. She's going to break. Everyone can see she's not equipped for this. Why couldn't Elias have sent her away for the weekend? Why did she have to be so present, so visible, so vulnerable? Then came the moment that changed everything. A prominent society matron, the kind of woman whose opinions shaped reputations, approached the refreshment table where Tarella was helping arrange glasses. The older woman studied the girl with sharp eyes, then turned to her companion and spoke in a carrying whisper that might have been deliberate. "Is she all right? She looks rather unstable." The word hung in the air like poison. Selena felt it enter her bloodstream, felt it reach back through years to that terrible night when someone had said the exact same thing about her sister. The same tone, the same cruel assessment disguised as concern. The same casual cruelty that destroyed vulnerable people while those speaking felt no accountability. Her vision narrowed, her chest constricted. Every sound in the room seemed to magnify. Overlapping conversations, clinking glasses, too loud laughter. The underlying current of judgment that permeated everything. She watched Tarella's hands tremble slightly as she continued working, apparently unaware of what had been said about her. The girl's gentleness suddenly looked like weakness. Her quietness looked like instability. Her attempts to help looked like desperate performing. Selena's mother materialized beside her, fingers gripping her arm with urgent pressure. "Did you hear what Madame Abeni just said?" Her voice was low, fierce. You need to control this situation, now, before people start talking, before this becomes a problem that overshadows everything. Control this situation. The words echoed. Control, contain, protect the image, protect the event, protect the reputation. Do whatever necessary to prevent disaster. Have you ever been pressured so much that you acted out of fear instead of reason? Tell me honestly. An hour later, the main activities had concluded and guests were beginning to disperse toward their accommodations. The staff was managing cleanup. The energy had shifted from formal performance to relaxed aftermath. People lingered in small groups, continuing conversations, extending the evening in that pleasant way that happens when events succeed. Selena found Torella in one of the side rooms, sitting quietly by herself, looking exhausted in the way people do when they've pushed beyond their natural limits. The girl's eyes lit up slightly when Selena approached. Hope for connection, for acceptance from this woman who would soon officially be her sister. Selena's heart was racing. Her mother's words kept cycling through her mind. The memory of her late sister's humiliation burned like acid. The fear of losing everything she'd worked for made her hands shake. But she kept her expression soft, concerned, sisterly. She suggested that Torella might need a break from all the chaos. Somewhere quiet to rest before tomorrow's early schedule. The girl agreed gratefully, standing with tired movements that spoke of someone who had given everything to get through the evening. Selena led her through the house toward the service wing. The hallway was quiet, removed from the remaining activity in the main rooms. Soft lighting created gentle shadows. The walls were bare here, functional rather than decorative. It felt like a different world than the opulent spaces they'd just left. She opened a storage room door, a small space used for off-season decorations and surplus supplies. It wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but it was windowless, isolated, meant for things rather than people. She told Torella she could rest here undisturbed, that it would be peaceful, that she'd come back soon to check on her. Torella looked confused, but trusting. She stepped inside without question, believing in this woman's good intentions, believing that this strange choice somehow made sense in the chaos of wedding preparations. Selena closed the door. The latch clicked with a soft finality. She stood there for a moment, hands still on the handle, part of her screaming that this was insane, that she needed to open the door immediately and apologize. But then she heard it. Torella had begun humming softly to herself, a gentle, meandering melody that served no purpose except to comfort. And that melody was the same one her late sister used to hum when she was anxious. The exact same pattern of notes. The recognition hit Selena like physical violence. Suddenly, she wasn't standing in her fiancé's house. She was back in that ballroom years ago, watching her sister break down, hearing the whispers, feeling the shame burn through her. She was at the funeral, wondering if she could have prevented everything. She was in all the moments since when she'd buried the guilt so deep she'd convinced herself it didn't exist. Terror overwhelmed her. Not terror of what she was doing, but terror of what that humming represented. Terror of repeating history. Terror of losing control of the narrative she'd so carefully constructed. Terror of being exposed as someone who couldn't protect the people she loved because she'd learned to prioritize image over humanity. She walked away. Not calmly, but in a blind panic that made no logical sense. She told herself it was temporary, that she'd come back soon, that she just needed time to think, to figure out how to manage tomorrow, to get her emotions under control. But she didn't come back. Hours passed in that small windowless room. Torella sat on the floor initially, still humming that melody, trying to understand why she'd been brought here. The confusion gave way gradually to concern, then to anxiety, then to something approaching fear. She called out several times. Her voice was soft at first, not wanting to cause problems, not wanting to seem difficult. But when no one answered, she tried louder. Then louder still, though shouting felt unnatural to her, felt like breaking some fundamental rule about how she was supposed to exist in the world. Her phone died after she'd sent one voice message to her brother, the battery finally giving out after she'd been using it as a flashlight to combat the oppressive darkness. She'd told him she wanted him home early tomorrow. She hadn't said why, hadn't wanted to worry him, hadn't wanted to seem needy. Just a simple request that had felt urgent for reasons she couldn't fully articulate. The cold set in gradually. The storage room had no heating, and as night deepened, the temperature dropped. She wrapped her arms around herself, her elegant dress providing little warmth. Her breath became visible in the dim light seeping under the door. To cope with mounting anxiety, she began tracing shapes in the thin layer of dust on the floor. Simple patterns at first, circles, squares, spirals, then more complex designs as the hours stretched, flowers, birds, abstract compositions that held meaning only to her. Her artist mind creating beauty even in this strange, frightening situation. She tapped on the door periodically, gently at first, then more insistently, though never frantically. Some part of her still believed this was a misunderstanding that would be resolved, that someone would remember she was here, that her brother would come looking for her, that this strange isolation couldn't possibly last, but the tapping grew weaker as exhaustion set in. Her voice, when she tried calling out, became hoarse. The cold made her body ache. The darkness made time impossible to track. She existed in a liminal space between consciousness and dissociation, her mind trying to protect her from the full reality of her situation by floating slightly above it. She thought about her brother, the way he'd always protected her, the way he'd built a life where she could feel safe, the way he'd never once made her feel like a burden despite all her anxieties and needs. She trusted he would find her. She just had to hold on until he did. The shapes in the dust grew more elaborate. The humming continued intermittently, and in that cold, dark room, a gentle soul waited with the kind of patience that comes from having survived worse, from knowing that light eventually returns, from believing that love is ultimately stronger than fear. Elias had been in Abuja when the voice message arrived. Business meetings that couldn't be postponed, last-minute contract negotiations that required his presence. He'd planned to return the day before the wedding, arriving with enough time to handle any final details, but avoiding the chaos of the rehearsal dinner. But something about his sister's message had unsettled him immediately. Not the words. They were simple, straightforward, but her voice had carried something underneath the surface. A tremor, a catch, the sound of someone trying very hard to sound normal while feeling anything but. He'd made excuses and left his meetings early, driving through the night with increasing urgency. The road stretched endlessly before him, his headlights cutting through darkness, his mind cycling through possibilities about what could be wrong. When he arrived home in those uncertain hours between night and morning, the wrongness was immediately apparent. Too quiet, too still. Wedding day should have meant activity, energy, the house alive with preparation. Instead, it felt abandoned. He moved through the familiar spaces with growing dread. The open bedroom door, the untouched bed, the abandoned slippers in the hallway. Each detail building a picture that made his chest tighten with fear. Then the sound. That faint, rhythmic tapping that pulled him like a thread through the house toward the service wing. The chair wedged under the door handle. The splintering wood as he forced it open. The collapse of his sister into his arms. She weighed almost nothing. Her skin was ice. She couldn't seem to focus her eyes properly. When he said her name, she responded, but slowly, as though traveling back from somewhere very far away. Her hands were raw, fingertips bleeding slightly where she'd scraped them against the door. There were patterns drawn in the dust around where she'd been sitting. Beautiful, heartbreaking patterns that spoke of hours spent alone, afraid, creating beauty as a form of survival. He held her and felt rage unlike anything he'd ever experienced. Not the hot, explosive kind, but something cold and absolute. The kind of fury that comes from a betrayal so fundamental it reshapes your entire understanding of reality. He looked up and saw Selena frozen in the hallway. Her cream silk robe, her tear-filled eyes, her hand pressed against her mouth in horror at her own actions. And in that moment, he understood that she had done this, that she had locked his sister in this room and walked away, that she had left her trapped and terrified for hours, that on their wedding day, she had proven herself capable of cruelty he couldn't begin to comprehend. He didn't yell, didn't demand explanations, simply held his sister and felt his entire future reshape itself around this singular moment of absolute clarity. What followed was chaos of a different kind. Medical attention for Torella, dehydration, mild hypothermia, severe anxiety. She was physically intact but psychologically devastated in ways that would take time to understand. Hotel staff brought blankets. A doctor was called. Elias stayed with her every moment, his hand in hers, his presence the only thing keeping her tethered to safety. Selena tried to approach multiple times, tried to explain, tried to apologize. But Elias's calm was more devastating than anger would have been. He simply looked at her, really looked as though seeing her for the first time, and stepped back. The message was clear. She was no longer welcome in his space, in his sister's space, in the life he was building. The wedding cancellation happened swiftly. Phone calls to key family members, announcements to staff, the machinery of a major social event grinding to a halt with brutal efficiency. The questions would come later. The gossip would be inevitable. But none of it mattered compared to the girl trembling in his arms. The sister he'd failed to protect by trusting someone who had proven unworthy of that trust. Selena's mother arrived to find the dream she'd orchestrated collapsing. The recriminations began immediately. Harsh words, accusations, desperate attempts to salvage something. But Elias was immovable. His decision was final. There would be no wedding, no compromise, no path forward that included the woman who had hurt his sister. Selena herself seemed to collapse inward. The polished facade crumbled, revealing the damaged, frightened person underneath. She had acted from her own unhealed trauma, had projected her fears onto an innocent person, had chosen image over humanity in a moment that defined her completely. And now, she faced the consequences: social ruin, personal devastation, the loss of everything she'd worked to build. But even in his rage, even in his protective fury, Elias recognized that she was also a victim. Not of his actions, but of her own unprocessed pain, of a society that valued appearance over authenticity, of a family system that had taught her to fear vulnerability as dangerous. She needed help. She needed healing, but she wouldn't find it in his presence. And she certainly wouldn't find it at the cost of his sister's well-being. The days that followed existed in a strange bubble of recovery and reckoning. Elias took Torella away from the house, checking them into a quiet boutique hotel where no one would find them, where the wedding chaos couldn't reach them, where they could simply exist together in safety. They spent long hours talking, processing, making sense of what had happened. Torella's understanding of the event was complicated. She hadn't immediately grasped the cruelty of being locked away, had initially assumed it was some kind of misunderstanding. But as she worked through it with her brother's patient presence, the betrayal began to register more fully. And yet, her biggest revelation wasn't about Selena at all. "I wasn't scared of her," she told him one evening as they sat on the hotel balcony watching the sunset over Lagos. "I was scared because you weren't there." The words hit him with unexpected force. He'd thought his presence in her life was supportive, protective, positive. But he suddenly understood that he'd become so essential to her sense of safety that his absence created vulnerability. She'd been so dependent on him being her shield that she'd never fully developed her own armor. It was a wake-up call about their dynamic, about how his protective love, while genuine and well-intentioned, had perhaps prevented her from building the internal resources she needed, about how healing wasn't just about feeling safe, but about learning to create safety for oneself. They talked about therapy, real professional support rather than just relying on each other. They talked about her art, about pursuing it more seriously, about building an identity separate from being Elias's sister. They talked about the trauma she'd experienced years ago, the events that had shaped her anxiety, the work still needed to transform survival into thriving. And slowly, in that quiet hotel room with evening light painting everything gold, they began to imagine a different kind of future. One where love wasn't about one person protecting another, but about both people growing stronger together. Where family meant support without dependency. Where healing was possible not because danger was eliminated, but because internal resilience was cultivated. Medical professionals came and went, monitoring Tarella's recovery. Lawyers handled the official cancellation proceedings. Family members called with questions. Elias deflected with polite firmness. The outside world continued its chaos, but inside their protected space, something essential was being rebuilt. News of the canceled wedding spread through Lagos society like wildfire. The gossip was inevitable, brutal, endlessly speculative. Some blamed Elias for being too protective. Some blamed Tarella for being too fragile. Some blamed Selena for reasons they couldn't fully articulate but sensed instinctively. The truth, when it eventually emerged through careful leaks and whispered conversations, was shocking enough to reshape reputations. A bride who locked her future sister-in-law in a storage room. The clear mental health crisis underlying such an action. The billionaire who chose family over social standing. The quiet sister who had survived yet another betrayal. Selena faced consequences that were both social and personal. Wedding venues blacklisted her. High society whispered about her instability. Business connections dissolved. Her carefully constructed position in elite circles crumbled. But underneath the social devastation, something else was happening. Her mother's grip on her loosened as the facade they'd both maintained collapsed completely. Without the pressure to perform perfection, without the constant striving to maintain appearances, Selena had space to finally confront the grief she'd been carrying for years. She entered therapy, real, intensive work with professionals who specialized in trauma and complicated grief. She began the slow, painful process of understanding how her unhealed pain had manifested in harming another vulnerable person. She faced the reality that her dead sister's humiliation had shaped her into someone who perpetuated the same cruelty she'd once witnessed. The work was excruciating. There were days when the shame felt insurmountable. Days when she wanted to flee back into the comfortable numbness of performing a role rather than being a person. Days when facing her own capacity for cruelty seemed impossible, but she kept going. Not because she believed she could ever make amends to Tarella, that bridge was burned beyond repair, but because she owed it to her late sister's memory to become someone different, someone who broke the cycle rather than perpetuating it, someone who chose healing over image, authenticity over performance, humanity over social standing. 6 months after the canceled wedding, Elias and Tarella moved to a new home. Smaller than the estate, more intimate, designed around peace rather than entertaining. A place with abundant natural light, a dedicated studio for her art, a garden where both could find quiet. Tarella had begun showing her work publicly. Small galleries at first, then larger exhibitions as people recognized her talent. Her art spoke to something essential about surviving pain while maintaining gentleness, about processing trauma through beauty, about finding strength without losing softness. She still had anxiety. Still had moments when crowded rooms overwhelmed her. Still needed her brother's presence in ways that spoke to deep attachment. But she was also developing her own tools, her own support systems, her own understanding of herself as someone capable of navigating difficulty. Elias had restructured his work to prioritize presence over expansion. He turned down opportunities that would require extensive travel. He hired people he trusted to manage aspects of his business that had once demanded his constant attention. He chose being available over being ambitious, recognizing that wealth meant nothing if it came at the cost of what truly mattered. Their relationship evolved into something healthier, still deeply bonded, but with more space for individual growth. Still protective, but with recognition that protection had limits. Still devoted, but with understanding that devotion meant supporting growth rather than preventing challenge. On their new home's balcony one evening, with the sky turning those impossible shades of orange and purple that made everything feel significant, they sat together in comfortable silence. The city stretched below them, alive with millions of individual stories of love and loss, of betrayal and redemption, of pain and healing. Tarella was sketching, her hands moving with confident grace across the page. Elias was reading, occasionally glancing up to watch the sunset or to check on his sister with that instinctive concern that would probably never fully disappear. "I'm glad you came home early," she said quietly, not looking up from her work. "I'll always come home when you need me," he replied. And it was both promise and recognition of limitation. He could be present, but he couldn't prevent all pain. He could offer safety, but she had to build security within herself. She smiled, understanding what he meant underneath the words. "I know, but I'm learning I can come home to myself, too." It was the kind of wisdom that comes from surviving, from facing darkness and choosing to continue creating light, from understanding that healing isn't about erasing pain, but about integrating it, about letting it transform you without letting it define you. The evening deepened around them, warm and gentle. The story that had begun with betrayal had transformed into something more complex, a narrative about how trauma echoes through time, how unhealed pain creates new wounds, how choosing family means sometimes disappointing society, how real love requires supporting growth even when it's uncomfortable. They didn't speak about Selena, didn't wonder about her healing journey, or speculate about her future. That was her work to do, her path to walk. They could wish her well from a distance while maintaining the boundaries necessary for their own well-being. Instead, they simply existed together in peace restored. The kind of peace that's earned through difficulty rather than given freely. The kind that recognizes shadows while choosing to face the light. The kind that understands happiness isn't the absence of pain, but the presence of people willing to sit with you through whatever comes. What would you have done if you were in Elias's position? Have you ever had to choose between love and family? Share your story in the comments. I read every single one. And if you believe family should always be our first priority, if you've ever stood up for someone who couldn't protect themselves, if this story moved you in any way, leave a like. Your support means everything and helps these stories reach the people who need them most.